my name is Chuck Zlatkin. I want to welcome everybody to this extraordinary event, Propaganda, How Propaganda Manufactures Consent, presented by the Big Apple Coffee Party, which is a group of nonpartisan grassroots activists that have been working on issues for a little over 9 years. And from time to time, we put on events around subjects that just don't seem to get the spotlight they deserve. So tonight, this is one of them. Our last event, which is available online, Making News, Faking News, How Disinformation Corrupts Democracy, and it still has value if you'd like to check that out. We're currently working with other groups in organizing NYC Free Assange. We hold a weekly Free Julian Assange and Free Chelsea Manning vigil and speak out in front of the New York Times building, 8th Avenue and 40th Street. That's every Thursday from 4:30 to 6 p.m. So we hope you'll join us when you can. And by the sound of it, you'll have no excuse not to come. Now it's my privilege to introduce the moderator for tonight's program. He's a comedian, writer, and activist, and host and head writer of the hit comedy news show Redacted Tonight with Lee Camp, on RT America. His new book, Bullet Points and Punchlines, will be out in the new year. And now I get to say, here's Lee Camp.
Hello, New York. How you doing? All right. Some good energy. I'm excited. This is a hell of a panel. I'm excited. You know, we've got a lot to talk about, a lot to get to. However, if at any point you decide this is not what you thought you came for, you aren't enjoying any of it, I talked to them about this, we will refund your ticket price. Completely. So excited to be here. To tell you a little bit how this is going to work is we're each going to do 10 minutes. I'm going to do my 10 minutes now, speaking to you about various topics on propaganda, about propaganda, different aspects of it. And then we're going to do another half hour where I question the panel, and then we'll go to you guys. So have your questions ready for that segment. I wanted to spend my little 10 minutes here on the language of propaganda. Because a lot of propaganda is done in simply the way they couch things, the way it's talked about, the way they phrase things in our mainstream media. And like, you don't even notice, a lot of people don't even notice they're doing it. Like when they started bombing Syria, I remember I was amazed at the number of times they said, and they're showing our missiles taking off, they kept saying, look at our advanced weaponry. Advanced weaponry, right? And they're having debates as to whether we should be doing it a little bit. But it's all couched in our advanced weaponry. That's not, bombing innocent civilians is not advanced. It's barbaric, all right? It's barbaric. Like, calling that advanced weaponry would be like if you're playing pool with someone, and you see two people playing pool, and then suddenly one of a person takes the pool cue and breaks it over the other guy's back. And you're like, that was pretty advanced. That was a pretty advanced move there. But this stuff is done endlessly in all of these conversations, especially around war, but around a lot that I'm going to get to. They also say 98% of our drones hit secondary targets. What's a secondary target? It's an innocent civilian. That's not a target at all right? It hasn't been targeted. But calling it a secondary target makes it sound okay, makes it sound justified. You know, if homeless people get money from our government, they call it welfare, they call it sucking off the state, right? But if the wealthy, if corporations get tax breaks, get money, get grants, then it's called a grant, right? It's called tax breaks for job creators. It has a different terminology. If you know, our billionaires, let's be clear, our billionaires that run this society, they are not fucking philanthropists. Can we stop calling them philanthropists? They are sociopaths. When you take that much, extract that much wealth out of the bottom 50% of the country, that is not philanthropy. Three guys own the same amount of wealth as the bottom 50% of our country. That's incredibly, it's insane and it's unstable. Our economy, you want to know how unstable our economy is? Just picture Chris Christie riding on the shoulders of Natalie Portman. That's our economy right there. We're told to worship these people. They're on the cover of magazines. This is part of the propaganda. They're on the cover of our magazines like heroes. But if it were 50% of anything else other than money, if 3 people had 50% of the country's iPhones or Siamese cats or York peppermint patties, we would lose our minds. We'd be like, why do they get all the peppermint patties? I want some of that chocolatey minty goodness. But because it's money, we're supposed to worship them. You know, when a protester breaks a window in a protest of a bank, it's called violence. Now, I'm fine with that being called violence, but I also think that when a bank forecloses on millions of homes, that is violence, all right? That is also violence. But that is never called violence in our media. You know, because to the homeowner, it's no different. Stealing their home and burning down their home is no different. It destroys their life, and people, 10,000 suicides connected to the last financial collapse. That is violence. And it's time we start talking about it that way. You notice when we don't support a government being overthrown, then it's called a coup. But if we support it, then it's people fighting for freedom, right? Like in Bolivia right now. It's a freedom fight. You know, if you have a kid and you withhold medicine and food to the point that they die, you're called a murderer, right? But if our government does it, like in Venezuela, it's called economic sanctions. It's a different thing, right? A study has come out showing we have killed 40,000 people in Venezuela due to our economic war, which is the way we should phrase it. It's economic war on people. So when people are dying, how is that not called a war? How is that not violence? You know, and so something, a bit of a side note here. I'm amazed with the hatred. I mean, it's thanks to our propaganda, but the hatred towards Venezuela, the hatred towards governments like Cuba by certain people in a lot of our society. And it's kind of like, what even if you, let's say you just despise socialism. Let's say you just hate it with a passion, like in your core, in your heart, you can't stand socialism. What does Cuba have to do with you? Let them live their lives however the hell they want to live them. I mean, being furious and wanting to hurt them, it'd be like if you just hated genital piercing so much that just knowing they're out there somewhere ruined your marriage. It's totally insane. In our coverage on Venezuela, including the New York Times, including NPR, everything, the Venezuelan military is often called troops loyal to Maduro. When was the last time the U.S. military was called troops loyal to Trump? But you don't even notice these things are being phrased that way. It sounds normal. It sounds okay. Oh, those are the troops loyal to Maduro. But what does that do? That gets us thinking maybe they'll flip. Maybe a lot of them are not loyal to Maduro. So if they called the U.S. military troops loyal to Trump, there'd be a lot of people saying, our military shouldn't fucking be there because why are they loyal to Trump? They shouldn't do that, right? But that's why they don't phrase it that way. That's why it's called the U.S. military. Sounds more cohesive, sounds together. We all support. Also, I've noticed our media, maybe you notice this, whenever they're talking about Israel, say the people being shot in the Great March of Return, unarmed people, children. 50% of Palestinians are under 18, so these are children being shot and killed. You notice they're often, not often, almost entirely, when it is, the rare moments it is covered, almost entirely it's covered in the passive voice. 25 Palestinians were killed. Oh, interesting. By what? By who? Who knows? I have an idea what they were killed by. Snipers shooting them. So that's how it should be phrased. You can have a debate as to whether it's justified or whatever, have that debate. But it is Israeli snipers shooting and killing these people. And that's how it should be discussed. In my last couple of minutes here before I bring on our incredible panel, I want to say that part of this in the language is about shifting the debate, shift the discussion, because if you're arguing inside the little window of allowable thought, then you've already lost. You've already lost the debate. You're in the acceptable area that the mainstream media has told us that's where you're allowed to think. You know, so when you're talking to your friends, when you're arguing with them, don't debate whether our drone bombs are killing too many civilians overseas. Debate whether we should be at war at all. Have that discussion, right? Shift the debate. Don't debate about whether corporations donate too much money to political campaigns. Debate about whether there should be corporations at all. Have that discussion. Whether there should be political money at all. You know, don't debate about whether your third drug charge should send you to jail for life. Debate about whether there should be drug charges at all, or it should be a health issue instead of a crime issue. Have that debate. Don't debate about whether our education system is creating too many dumb children. Debate about whether we should have dumb children at all, or whether they should be released into the woods to create a moron Lord of the Flies. All right, I'm going to bring your incredible panel on here. You ready? All right, I'm so excited about this. Our first panelist is an award-winning journalist and the author of several books, including best-selling Republican Gomorrah, Goliath, The 51-Day War, and The Management of Savagery. I always hate when someone's written more books than I've read. He has produced print articles for an array of publications, many video reports, and several documentaries, including Killing Gaza. And he founded The Gray Zone in 2015 to shine a journalistic light on America's state of perpetual war and its dangerous domestic repercussions. Please give it up for Max Blumenthal. I'm going to bring all three. Our next panelist is a writer and activist for peace and justice issues. She has been an editor and senior columnist for Black Agenda Report since its inception in 2006. She serves on the coordinating committee of the Black Alliance for Peace, the administrative committee of the United National Anti-War Coalition, and the advisory board of exposefacts.org. She is a contributor to the OR Books anthology In Defense of Julian Assange. Her first book, Presidential, Black America and the Presidents, will be published by Steerforth Press on February 4th, 2020. Please give it up for Margaret Kimberley. And finally, our next panelist is the host of Pushback, a news show from the Gray Zone and a contributor to The Nation magazine. His coverage of Russiagate won a 2019 Izzy Award for Outstanding Achievement in Independent Media. He has previously worked as a host and producer at Democracy Now! And The Real News, and as a producer at Al Jazeera English. His writings also regularly appear in Real Clear Investigations and Le Monde Diplomatique. Please give it up for Aaron Maté. Welcome, everybody. Welcome. How are you? Good. We're going to go down the line, and each of you have 10 minutes, but if you'd like to stand up there, that'd be awesome. We have a mic set up for you. So, Aaron, if you'd like to.
It's really great to be here. Thank you to Chuck and Bernadette and all the other organizers. It's really a thrill. I want to talk about the issue of how propaganda manufactures consent. What I want to discuss briefly is this topic in the context of how I think propaganda in the Trump era has enrolled liberals and progressives in something I think really dangerous for the world and also dangerous politically for progressive politics in general and the prospects of stopping right-wing politicians and right-wing power. I'll begin with Russiagate. We all know now Russiagate was a scam and it was a political failure, but it happened for very deliberate reasons, and I think we need to reckon with those reasons. It arose, I think, because of a convergence of very powerful interests, and all those interests had the same ultimate interest, which is protecting their own privilege. And what the beauty of their con is they got to enroll millions of people in it, including liberals and progressives. So Russiagate begins with the 2016 campaign. Already on the campaign trail, you have national security state elites voicing public opposition and concern about Donald Trump, not because they care about his racism or his misogyny, but because they don't see him as a suitable steward of the US empire. They also don't like the fact that he's deviating from certain orthodoxies, although the extent to which he means, the extent to which he's sincere about that is in question. But he's talking about having better relations with Russia, and he's also voicing rhetorical opposition to military intervention abroad. So he's challenging the consensus of the bipartisan foreign policy establishment, perhaps doing it as a con because he's a good salesman, and I think it was a con, but nonetheless, he's doing it. So we see the hostility to Trump already arise then. Meanwhile, what's going on behind the scenes, we learn later on, is an actual investigation of a potential Trump-Russia conspiracy based on totally specious grounds that we don't have to go into now, but the results show just how baseless it was. The Mueller report couldn't even find a single member of the Trump campaign interacting with anybody actually acting on the Russian government's behalf. Only people who claim to know Russians or who might have a Russian passport. Meanwhile, you have the Clinton campaign, and even before the election, they were latching onto this talking point that they had developed of Trump as a Putin puppet. And after they lose the election in the surprise, shocking loss, they have a meeting, as is reported in the book Shattered, within 24 hours of Hillary Clinton's concession speech, and they decide that this election was not on the up and up, and that one of the main reasons they lost was James Comey, the FBI director, who came out with an October surprise, but also Russia. And they decide very deliberately to push that narrative above all else. And from that point, we have a nonstop effort blaming Russia and blaming stolen emails for the loss of the Clinton campaign. Zero self-reflection on the part of the Clintons and their people for why they actually lost. And there's a very good reason for that, because honest self-reflection would mean looking critically at your own policies. And given the fact that so many people were duped into believing that Trump was a working class champion who was going to take on the neoliberal establishment, for Democrats to transform and to actually offer a real alternative to Trump and show people why that was a con, that would mean challenging their own privileged role within that system and basically giving up their role as the beneficiaries of the corrupt system that Trump fooled people into thinking he was opposing. And then we have the media, and then we have the media latching onto this because catering to the national security state and the establishment wing is, generally the function of the elite media, which wants to sell advertisements to privileged sectors and wants to reach elite audiences and sell them a worldview that reinforces their own privilege. And also, this whole thing is great for ratings. They have a nonstop spy thriller. Well, what is the impact on everybody else? Well, the population, after some initial flare-ups of authentic resistance, remember all of us going to the airports to oppose the Muslim ban, and the excitement of an actual resistance in the early days of the Trump of the Trump era, well, all that gets kicked to the curb, and the general population is reduced to being spectators in an inter-elite battle, where now all of a sudden intelligence officials are our heroes, and Trump is to be opposed not because of anything he's doing to the general population, not because of his record tax heist, the largest upward transfer of wealth in U.S. history with his tax cuts, but because he's not saying mean things about Vladimir Putin. And in public, he's appearing nice to Vladimir Putin. And what does this lead to? Well, so, Trump's resistance, so-called resistance, is reduced to being led by unhinged conspiracy theorists positing that Trump is a Russian agent. All this hands Trump a massive gift, and that instead of actually opposing him, people are clinging on to these crazy theories. Another gift comes when all this finally collapses, culminating in Robert Mueller, our savior figure, delivering testimony in July and not even being familiar with the details of his own investigation, the one that was supposed to bring down Donald Trump. Now, one day later, Ukraine Gate begins, and it's pretty much a similar thing, a lot of parallels. The one difference is that this time it looks like Trump actually did something. There does appear to be some kind of scheme that he was overseeing to pressure Ukraine, although from the available evidence, I don't think it got very far, but we'll see. Maybe something will come up. But the parallels to Russiagate are enough, I think, to give pause and to be seriously concerned. Again, the source of the worry originates with the national security state. And what are they upset about? When Trump froze aid to Palestinian refugees, to UNRWA, in a deliberate bid, this was openly expressed, to basically pressure Palestinian negotiators to give up their internationally recognized right of return. So straight up blackmail. Or when Trump freezes aid to Central American migrants, and in fact uses that aid to pay the salaries of the coup plotters who he's trying to install in Venezuela. These national security state officials don't say anything. But what did he do here? He froze briefly some aid or some money that was used to buy U.S. weapons to give to Ukraine to continue a proxy war that the U.S. basically started back in 2014. That's what the issue is here. And in the process, he also sought some investigations that could have implicated Joe Biden, who also happens to be another member of the elite, in the same way that the damage of Russiagate, or the main offense that Trump was supposedly committed, was that he conspired in an effort to weaken another member of the elite, Hillary Clinton, which of course he didn't. But in this case, again, Trump goes after Joe Biden, and you can't do that. You can bomb Cambodia like Nixon did. You can kill and spy on activists like Nixon did. That's not impeachable, but going after another faction of the elite, that is. And so right now we're once again being enrolled in another national security state generated quote-unquote scandal, with the promise again that that is going to bring down Trump. And the fantasy of this being, the beginning of the end is once again very much prevalent. And that's the danger for domestic politics. To the world, the fact that the underlying policy is not even scrutinized. So why are we arming Ukraine? Why are we fueling this proxy war? And why are we incentivizing Trump to increase tensions with nuclear-armed Russia? That is not being discussed. And that is one area where the dangers here are catastrophic, not just for progressive political fortunes, but for the entire world. And I'll leave it there, and I'll pick up more in the question period. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Margaret?
Good evening, everybody. Thank you. Thank you so much. I want to thank the Big Apple Coffee Party, Chuck Slatkin, Bernadette Evangelist, and others who brought us all together tonight, and of course the community church. Thank you all again for being a venue for people such as ourselves who are often excluded, which is the basis of propaganda. It's a funny thing, when I was trying to figure out what to talk about propaganda, it's like, well, what propaganda do I talk about? There's so much material there. And just a few examples. Ukraine Gate now is in the news. And there have been thousands of words written, many hours of programming. But do they ever tell you that the United States overthrew the elected president of Ukraine? And that when the US and other NATO nations deposed him, they put people in office, some of whom were just out-and-out Nazi sympathizers. You don't see any mention. You hear about Venezuela a lot. Maduro has to talk to the opposition. Well, he did. And when he did, and when he and opposition forces were on the verge of together jointly asking for an end to sanctions, the US government dropped the hammer, told the opposition not to talk to him anymore, and said Guaido is president. Syria, President Assad gassed his own people, we're told over and over again. But now there are two whistleblowers from the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons who dissent from the official findings and publicly state they were rigged. So where to begin? There's so much. So I decided to stick with a domestic issue, and when you write and speak, it's like, well, what moves you? What moves me the most? And I had my own personal meltdown a few months ago when this phrase appeared, Moscow Mitch, in reference to Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell. And it all started when he opposed efforts to impose verified voting, paper ballots and so forth. And of course, there's more propaganda telling us that the Russian government, they didn't just collude, they hacked our voting system, and thus this moniker, Moscow Mitch, was born. Now, he does not want verifiable voting, that's true, but the reasons have nothing to do with Russia. The Republican Party lives and dies by its ability to steal votes, mostly from black people. There's voter suppression through felon disenfranchisement and voter ID laws. There's also actual theft and the changing of votes with these mechanical systems. And the victims of these practices are mostly black people, but the news didn't mention this, and neither did most black people, sadly. Vote theft, or rather the cover-up of vote theft, is among the most prevalent points of propaganda in the country. And McConnell ought to be exposed, but for the right reasons. We've seen two presidential elections since 2000 where the outcome was determined by this. Bush did it in 2000, his brother disenfranchised black Floridians. Hillary Clinton, we're told, lost the Electoral College by only 78,000 votes. But there were thousands of uncounted votes in places like Detroit. And lies by the corporate media and their collusion with the Democratic Party ensures that this is going to go on. And by the way, Democrats don't say anything about this either. But I have a special kind of anger for the people who we at the Black Agenda Report call the Black Misleadership class. They know the deal. They know why Mitch McConnell wants to steal votes, but they don't say anything because they're captives of the Democratic Party. Some fear biting the hand that feeds them, some are cynics, some may be true believers, but the end result is that this injustice goes on. So, along comes 2016. A racist, failed real estate developer, and Trump is that, succeeded, only thing he succeeded at was promoting himself through the media. And he defeated Hillary Clinton, who was a terrible politician, who had her own integrity issues, and that allowed him to squeak through in the Electoral College along with the vote theft. But neither she nor the Democrats say anything about the Electoral College. She's still hanging around, she's got something to say. Has she once said anything about the Electoral College? So the Democrats, they claim to be the inclusive party, the progressive party, but they're nothing of the sort. The differences between the two parties are small and getting smaller. And all they can say is that they're outwardly less racist than Republicans. After starting with Bill Clinton, when they decided to become a corporate-backed party as much as the Republicans, what did we get? Bill Clinton, media consolidation, welfare reform that put millions of people into poverty, bombing Serbia, pushing NATO expansion. Barack Obama bailed out the banks with trillions of dollars, destroyed Libya, tried to destroy Syria, and never said anything about the black people who loved him unless his goal was to scold and dismiss them. And he's still doing that now, even though he's not president. So Trump was anathema to black people for very obvious reasons. Instinctively, we knew someone talking about make America great again wasn't talking about us. But he won and solidified black people's allegiance to this party that does nothing, including not win elections. And that's why otherwise smart people will talk about Moscow Mitch or collusion or some other such thing. And I think it's Russiagate, I think it resonates because it's comforting to people. It's hard to admit that the Democrats are as bad as they are, that Hillary Clinton was as bad as she was, and it's easier to believe that some guy in a foreign country who you've been told is evil millions of times actually changed the results of an election, and not the party you cling to that raised $1 billion and still couldn't get 78,000 more votes. But the cure for all this propaganda is to tell the truth. And who's going to tell it? The duopoly in this country, the political duopoly, is composed of a far-right party and a center-right party. I don't even know if the Democrats are center-right anymore. But they, speaking of collusion, they collude with the corporate media and they dole out information or misinformation that benefits their crooked arrangement. So black people have gone from being the most savvy, most politically minded group in the country, the most left-leaning traditionally, and now live in hope that the same intelligence agencies that destroyed our liberation movement are suddenly going to save us from Trump. So we have so many lies going on here, and propaganda is nothing but systematized lying. That ramped up into high gear when the system wanted to make people who made demands go away. And that means history has to be disappeared, people have to be disappeared. And I'm glad I'm old enough to remember, a few days ago was the 50th anniversary of enormous marches in Washington and around the country against the Vietnam War. It's estimated 2 million people. There are two marches, one in October, one in November of 1969. And if I didn't remember it myself, I might not know that it happened. So we're propagandized to believe that that never happened, which means you can't do it again, which means you have to rely on the electoral system. All you can do is vote. That's all you can do is vote. And you have to vote for the Democrats, and you can't ask them anything, you can't demand anything, because then you'll get Trump. But people in the rest of the world are in movement, in Haiti, in Ecuador, in Bolivia. And many of us say, why doesn't that happen here? Because we propagandize more. So here we are with Ukraine Gate starting, and the media, and it's disgusting to watch these. I don't know if I can't stomach it for very long, these Democrats fawning over some guy because he's in a uniform, but anyway. So here we have a situation where people who are triggered by Trump are unable to think for themselves and never follow the logical path of naming and shaming the people whose corruption and its resulting ineptitude put him in office. I was surprised to see after 2016 how so few people expressed any anger towards Hillary Clinton or the Democrats. And there's a couple of reasons for that. The master of propaganda was Barack Obama, and he's been proving that again with his words of late, but it's having less resonance, I believe. And we all remember hope and change, but if you were paying attention, you knew it was BS even then. Now he's running all over the world when he isn't giving speeches, getting paid $500,000, wagging his finger and telling us you can't ask for anything. You can't have anything you want. So I'm going to close now. I'm running out of time. It always takes more time than I think. So here we are, stuck with people who are on the losing side. But Not only do people think the Democrats are their only political choice, but this party they cling to can't even deliver on its claim of electability. That's all we hear, electability, electability. They lost 1,000 seats while Obama was president. In Congress, in state legislatures, all they had left was a presidency, and they messed up and they lost that too. But most people won't say so. And there's a couple things, I know I'm over time a little bit, but you can tell you're being propagandized if you're told 1 month, James Comey is evil, it's his fault Trump is president. And then a few months later, Comey, hooray, he's gonna save us. Jeff Sessions, when he appointed him Attorney General, people were like, oh my God, it's so terrible, old segregationist. Then there was some Russiagate nonsense and he could be fired, and people literally protested to protect Jeff Sessions. Well, at least we know people who are capable of still going, of protesting. So I'm gonna wrap it up. But that's all because of propaganda. And it's nothing but lies being told endlessly by powerful people and institutions. Thank you all very much.
And Max.
Supposed to wait till I'm done. Thank you. Is anyone streaming this by any chance? No? Someone must be recording. All right, good. Thank you. All right, I hope to see some video when this is over. Thank you to Chuck Slatkin and Bernadette Evangelista for getting this. Yes, please. It's good to be here with Joseph Stalin. Since I get called a tanky now all the time. Tanky, you're a tanky for being against war and regime change. Like even mainstream people use this old obscure Trotskyist term, tanky. It's weird. We're living in weird times. I wrote down some thoughts when I was in the green room, and I'll just kind of read them off, and hopefully it doesn't last much longer than 10 minutes. Because the panel, we have to basically each all say a different version of the same really important thing during Q&A. I want to kind of pick up where Margaret left off, because she was talking about the Vietnam War, the era of liberation movements, which were attacked by COINTELPRO, by a information war managed by the FBI, destabilization campaign. I remember a time not too long ago in a galaxy not far away when hundreds of thousands of New Yorkers marched in the streets against a war. Do you all remember that? Yeah. What the hell happened? I mean, it's good to see so many people out here, but the wars never stopped. But the rallies against them, they kind of have dwindled out. Notice that. It's just like us and our friends, like, hey, what's up? How you been? I haven't seen you in 2 minutes. You're looking well. And the most shocking thing is that some of our major progressive media institutions have actually become platforms for promoting these wars. And I'm not going to name any names. We all know what I'm talking about. Okay. Many self-identified progressives, as Aaron has demonstrated again and again, have become captives to the partisan theater scripted by the bureaucratic architecture of the national security state that has on its record the destabilization of large swaths of the globe. And so while Chileans and Haitians and Ecuadorians and indigenous and leftist Bolivians are in open revolt against austerity policies and right-wing governments imposed on them from within and without, so many self-styled progressives have been reduced to spectators, captivated by wall-to-wall coverage of Russiagate and Ukrainegate on corporate networks that function as a de facto retirement community for disgruntled spooks. What's going on here is that the managers of savagery, the managers of our national security state, these soft-handed super predators, seem to have learned the lessons of Iraq, which is that even the most advanced conventional army on earth can be ground down by a few committed fedayeen, and that middle-class Americans will take to the streets when the coffins of their boys come home. And so the national security state has turned to hybrid warfare, a sophisticated three-tiered method of war making that contains little risk of domestic political repercussions. Though, as I illustrated in my book, The Management of Savagery, it's absolutely guaranteed to generate blowback in the form of, for example, mass civilian casualty events like the Manchester bombing carried out by a UK proxy fighter who helped destroy the Libyan government and went to and from Libya on the MI6 rat line, or through the rise of right-wing nationalist forces from Western Europe to Washington, who've successfully exploited the fear and loathing of desperate refugees created by NATO's regime change wars. The first dimension of hybrid warfare should be the most familiar, non-conventional war, or arming the rebels, the moderate rebels, as we've seen in Syria, in Libya, and as we see in Ukraine, where arms are even flowing into the hands of the neo-Nazi Azov battalion, despite the best efforts of members of Congress like John Conyers, who's no longer there. And before that, we know about the arming of the Contras in Central America. For some reason, Democrats were willing to speak out against that at that time. Different era. When the government the rebels are facing begins to kill and imprison them in ham-handed fashion in order to preserve the state that is under attack by the most powerful empire in history, that government becomes the target of 800-page Human Rights Watch reports and then faces the second weapon in hybrid warfare, which is sanctions or unilateral coercive measures aimed to destroy their economies and pulverize their civilian populations. I just witnessed a really disturbing interview with Elizabeth Warren on Pod Save America, this podcast of these kind of like yuppie Democratic apparatchiks. And this guy, I think it's like Tommy Vitor, is saying, you know, Trump had such a great policy in Venezuela. It was a brilliant diplomatic move, and you know, not just recognizing Juan Guaido, who's like the Pete Buttigieg of Latin America, but in preventing Venezuela from having an economy. He said, preventing Venezuela from having an economy. And Elizabeth Warren comes up, she says, you know how she always leads in, she goes, so? And I'm thinking she's going to say something rational, and she said, I'm all for the sanctions. I'm all for that. I'm all for recognizing Juan Guaido, and she's just all in. I mean, I guess this is what Hillary Clinton meant by saying she was going to run again, is that... And so, you know, big structural change Bailey rolled over for IMF structural readjustment policy Bailey. This is the insidiousness, again, of hybrid warfare, where you have a self-styled progressive advancing economic terrorism against civilian populations from Venezuela to Iran to Syria, where people went without heating oil last winter. The final and most insidious aspect of hybrid warfare, which we're pretty much talking about tonight, is information warfare. This modality weaponizes the media and civil society to generate consent among the public for what impeachment celebrity and previously unknown national security apparatchik Alexander Vindman called the interagency consensus of foreign policy, which the president is apparently forbidden from opposing even if he or she was elected to do so. You know, the intelligence community, which is neither communal nor intelligent, has the final say on foreign policy. And whoever we vote for doesn't matter. And what does he mean by the consensus of foreign policy? He means regime change, empire. So in order to manufacture consent for the imperial foreign policy consensus, our national security state establishes propaganda constructs to invent reality. These entities are often funded by CIA spin-offs like USAID and the National Endowment for Democracy, which was created to do what its co-founder Alan Weinstein said the CIA used to do covertly, but this time overtly, in the open. The NED is the engine of violent right-wing opposition movements from Nicaragua to Venezuela to Bolivia, where the US-backed coup leader Luis Fernando Camacho and his sig-heiling paramilitaries have terrorized indigenous people for years. Behold the fruits of democracy promotion. I have 2 minutes, and I was going to talk a little about the most notable and award-winning propaganda construct known as the Syrian White Helmets, which were established not in Syria, but in Turkey by a former military intelligence officer named James Le Mercier, handed over $100 million by the British Foreign Office and USAID, given HD cameras to enter areas controlled by the local affiliate of Al-Qaeda and its allies, areas where Western journalists were forbidden from entering for fear of literally losing their heads. And they were at the forefront of every major red line event alleging chemical weapons use and successfully helping to trigger US military interventions which prolonged the war and prolonged the death of so many Syrians, and who now face unprecedented scrutiny thanks to the appearance of the 2 previously mentioned whistleblowers in the OPCW who alleged that the Duma chemical weapons attack was in fact not a chemical weapons attack and a pro-war fabrication. We were lied to. Again, the mysterious death of Le Mercier, who's been branded a hero by the New York Times and a white savior by the Washington Post, who, according to the Washington Post Middle East correspondent, saved more people than anyone in Syria, has been predictably swept under the rug, more so than Jeffrey Epstein's death. The few isolated critics of this propaganda construct who are like, could fit in this room and probably are in this room, and of, regime change operations in Latin America, of domestic political deceptions like Russiagate have been blacklisted, labeled Assadists, Russian and Venezuelan assets, and suppressed on social media, while Pod Save America is pushed to the top of your YouTube feed. National security state marionettes like Jake Tapper win awards and plaudits for pushing the consensus line, while the most important journalist and publisher of our time, Julian Assange, languishes in a cell, threatened with extradition to a country he's not a citizen of, and threatened with torture. Threatened with torture. I'm about to stop. I thought about Assange a lot in my own prison cell, where I spent 2 days on a false charge fabricated by members of a US-backed Venezuelan opposition, and I thought about what we could do to support him. And one thing we can do is to continue to use WikiLeaks as a treasure trove of information, of proven facts exposing the sadism of the managers of savagery in our national security state, and to inform the public about what empire truly does and what it means for people on the other side of the gun. And at the Gray Zone, we've been going to the ground and breaking the media blockade in countries that are targeted for regime change simply for their desire to be independent and sovereign, and in some cases, socialist. We are going to say the unsaid and the unsayable, because so much of propaganda is rendering us silent and rendering the public ignorant. We are going to put out the fires that these arsonists keep lighting across the globe. And finally, I just thank all of you for all the support you've shown me in these past weeks. And we'll be talking more about that throughout the night. Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, we've already scared some people off. That's good. That's good. Well done, Max.
Was that bad?
And by the way, I think most of you know this, but WikiLeaks has never published something false. Never. Compare that to every other mainstream media outlet that can't go 30 seconds without their head up their ass. I mean, Chuck Todd did half of the last episode facing the wrong direction, all right? So let's get to some questions, and then we'll get to some of your questions soon. Margaret, I want to start with you. Part of successful propaganda is erasing anything that stands up to the propaganda, that calls it out. Can you talk about the suppression, censorship, and attacks the Black Agenda Report has gotten over the years, and how you deal with it? And maybe grab that mic.
Okay, thank you. Well, we were a few years ago, I was right after the 2016 election. This mysterious list appeared on the Washington Post, which means it wasn't that mysterious at all. Bezos's paper. It's called Propaganda or Not, Prop or Not. And it was a list of sites and individuals who were said to be under Russian influence, and Black Agenda Report was among them. And we were very proud of that, actually. We have the right enemies. So things like that are efforts to silence. It's supposed to be like some, hall of shame or something like that, but I think it told discerning people who was telling the truth and who wasn't. So we get those attacks. Actually, our worst attacks were when Obama was president. As Obama critics, that's when we caught a lot of heat. But we've experienced, and after that, we experienced what many other websites experienced, a loss of traffic. I would go on Google looking for articles that I knew I had written with my name, with Black Agenda for, and couldn't find them. No. So we are under attack, and these platforms, which held so much promise, because it was an opportunity you could get your voice out. You weren't depending on someone else. Well, they certainly clamped down on that. And now we have, and to follow up on what I was saying, we have people calling themselves progressives saying that Facebook should be a fact checker. That is the last thing in the world that we should want. Getting advice from the Atlantic Council, we don't want them checking facts. They need to have transparency, and they need to stop, for example, letting the Israeli government tell them which Palestinians can have a page on Facebook or not. So those are the kinds of things we experience. And then again, sometimes it seems very passive. You're just not asked. It's you can write good stuff. You can have good writers, but if you're saying the wrong thing, if you're giving the wrong answers, then you don't get the visibility, you don't get the invitations, but that's okay. We end up on Prop or Not, so that makes up for it.
Yeah, she's absolutely right about search engines. By the way, everybody should do their best, and I realize it's hard to switch away from Google for a lot of your searches. If you do a search on Google, as she's saying with her articles, but you do a similar search on DuckDuckGo, for example, you will find a completely different result page because Google has ranked down anything that doesn't fit into the mainstream narrative. And I've been, Redacted Tonight has been incredibly suppressed. YouTube's not showing our videos to people anymore. They unsubscribe people. On Facebook, my Facebook page, which was very large and was gaining tons of people, has been capped for the past 2 years, shadow capped, can't gain people on Facebook, they're not showing to people. So it is an endless amount of suppression. I don't know if anyone else wants in on this. Max?
Well, I actually called Twitter in 2017 to ask them about some of this suppression, and I was handed over to their spokesperson, who was the former spokesperson for Barack Obama's National Security Council. The head of Twitter's Middle East bureau is a reserve officer in the United Kingdom 77th Brigade, which is the public information office of its military. In other words, the propaganda arm of the British military and the British Foreign Office. So that tells you a lot about what Silicon Valley is doing with these social media platforms. They've become honeycombed with national security state operatives in order to enforce a certain perspective and to suppress another one.
Right, and so, we rely on people like you to share this stuff and get it out even when we are incredibly suppressed. Aaron, I wanted to ask you, you've been in the news biz for a long time. You've interviewed a lot of amazing people at different outlets. There's a constant fight in media for access to certain types of guests. Can you talk about what access means and how it pushes so many networks and journalists towards a propagandistic reporting?
Well, just look at the staffing of the two major liberal networks now. So, the biggest scandal for Trump's term has been Russiagate, now it's Ukrainegate. But there's a lot of parallels as we talked about. And look at who some of their top analysts are. So, on MSNBC, you have a senior national security analyst named John Brennan, the former director of the CIA, who also played, I think, a critical, if not the critical role in generating Russiagate to begin with. One of his new fellow MSNBC analysts is Andrew Weissman, who, as I think the Mueller hearing revealed, when, again, Mueller did not know the basic details of his own probe, I think that underscored that Andrew Weissman, who was on Mueller's team, was the real head of that probe. So, and then over on CNN, you have former Director of National Intelligence, James Clapper, you have Andrew McCabe, you have Jim Baker, all key officials who served in the intelligence community under Obama and played a role in Russiagate. So literally now, when you have the two major networks covering, you know, the biggest story of Trump's presidency, they're literally covering their employees, you know, and that dynamic, unfortunately, it's not even a matter of professional alliances in that way. It's just because media networks have, especially in the Trump era, deemed intelligence officials to be their saviors. The scrutiny on their behavior is pretty much absent, and it's relegated either to outlets like the Gray Zone, or it's on pro-Trump sites that don't like these people because he's going after their hero, and everyone else is just sort of worshiping them and taking their actions and their words on faith. And of course, this isn't just unique to the Trump era. We saw it during the Iraq War, and we've seen it forever. But I think one distinction we can draw with the Trump era, as Max has talked about a lot too, is that it's enrolled liberals and progressives in thinking that all this is great.
All of it's great, and the intelligence community is our heroes yet again. So it's good we got back to that. Max, I wanted to ask you about one of the most important forms of propaganda is just lying by way of omission, just leaving it out. An example of like what the genocide Saudi Arabia has created in Yemen was not talked about for several years. I mean, starting under Obama, there was a whole, I think FAIR did a study, or someone did a study, and MSNBC didn't mention Yemen for an entire year. I think it was 2016 or something. And anyway, I wanted to ask you about the propaganda of ignoring stories, and a good example is recently your arrest, which you'd think your colleagues, fellow journalists, might be concerned if DC police come to a fellow journalist's house, arrest him for false charges from 5 months ago without warning. That might bother them, and they might mention it, but it was kind of not talked about.
Speaking of ignoring stories, I heard there's a front-runner candidate named Bernie Sanders. Not hearing too much about that. It's like the Buttigieg surge. He is pulled into 4th place. He's surging.
Literally, New York Times did a cover story about how he got 700 people to show up. Bernie gets 700 people when he takes a shit in the bathroom. Like, it's...
Yeah. There are so many layers to, ignoring and omission. I read in the New York Times that Evo Morales is deepening the divide by accusing his opponents of being racist and anti-indigenous, and even of overseeing a coup. So it's kind of like, let's put all that into question. Was it a military? Well, that's what Evo Morales says. So if you look at any Reuters dispatch on Venezuela, there'll be an article on Jack Ryan, this new regime change propaganda show, action show, which is like Tom Clancy, Cold War kitsch repurposed for millennials on Amazon Prime, pushing just a ridiculous narrative about Venezuela, and so Reuters will write about it and they'll say, Nicolas Maduro, the increasingly authoritarian leader, says that Jack Ryan is bad. They won't interview some academic or present the other side. They always go to the leader. Same with Syria. Bashar al-Assad denies that he killed 7 million puppies. Something like that. And then speaking of Syria, to be a little more serious, I mean, this is where we've seen, I think, one of the most sophisticated and expensive propaganda tidal waves. It may be more sophisticated than Iraq because, as I said, it employs the kind of modalities of hybrid warfare, and most Americans don't even know didn't even know the U.S. was involved until Trump abandoned the Kurds. And so here's two things that have gone unmentioned. The first is that you saw this freak out emanating from Washington, spreading throughout the country, using the kind of partisan divide against Trump to mobilize Democrats about the supposed abandonment of the Kurds, where Trump was redeploying something like 400 U.S. soldiers from the Al-Hasaka province, which is heavily Kurdish in northern Syria, to Syria's oil wells to basically protect their oil from ISIS. In other words, to steal their oil. And this was part of a deal in which the Turkish government, Erdogan, would get to create a so-called buffer zone in which he will basically begin to ethnically cleanse Kurdish regions and the pre-existing population, and then repopulate it with Syrian refugees who've been living in Turkey. And in order to wage that assault on the Kurdish YPG, renamed the Syrian Democratic Forces by a U.S. general, to go after a U.S. proxy, Erdogan repurposed the old U.S. proxies among the moderate rebels. In other words, the groups that the CIA and the Pentagon armed. 21 of the 28 groups comprising the so-called Turkish Free Syrian Army participated in this heinous and bloody invasion of northern Syria, and everyone was freaking out in Washington about it. But these same groups previously comprised the Free Syrian Army that the CIA itself set up, that John McCain went and visited and said, I'll see you in Damascus. We'll go lynch those Alawites together, And so Samantha Power, this is like the ultimate compartmentalization, denounced the brutality of the Turkish Free Syrian Army. But Samantha Power in the Obama administration said that these people, in an Atlantic article, this was reported by former Israeli prison guard Jeffrey Goldberg, who's the executive editor of the Atlantic, that Samantha Power is painting them as carpenters and ordinary workers who are just like the American Minutemen. And we've seen them denounced as brutal pirates and terrorists, but these are the same people doing the same things they did to Syrians all along. This has been completely left out of coverage of what's happening in northern Syria. They're basically being attacked and condemned because they're attacking a former U.S. proxy is attacking a current U.S. proxy.
And in terms of leaving stuff out, I know we focused a lot on foreign policy, but it's done in our domestic propaganda as well. Our mainstream media will celebrate that the stock market is doing so well, like everyone should be dancing in the streets. They will leave out that 80% of all stocks are owned by 10% of the population, and that corporate stock does very well when workers are effectively exploited. So those things are not mentioned when we're supposed to be throwing confetti about the Wall Street returns on investment. Another piece of successful propaganda is making sure we just forget our history so that the ruling elite, powers that be, can repeat it or rewrite it as suits them. They've tried to get us to forget about WMD in Iraq, right? We're supposed to forget that our media did that to us. We're supposed to forget that the intelligence community was an utter disaster for that and lying to us. We're just move past that, trust them implicitly. They want us to forget about McCarthyism now, so we can just do it again. Yay! It's the re-up. But of course, this is, I'm just mentioning recent historical amnesia. We also have erased the old, longer ago oppression of people of color, indigenous people. Margaret, you spoke of memory. Can you speak to the correlation between propaganda and historical amnesia?
Yeah, people, there's historical amnesia. It's engineered. Things are disappeared, people are disappeared, or they're, the story is changed. I remember when I was a kid, I was always told how the Soviets would change history, and they took Trotsky out of the history books, and I see all these things now when Bernie Sanders has just disappeared from the coverage of all the candidates, and the person who's the most popular is taken out. They will tell us what we should remember. They will, Veterans Day just passed, the veterans, thank you for their service. You can't criticize them, you can't criticize war. You can't talk about how the country really treats veterans. I mean, if you wanted to talk about Veterans Day, why don't you talk about that? The number of homeless veterans, jobless veterans, the fact that these recruiters lie to kids to get them to join up. So they will tell you, recently there was the commemoration of the how many years? 80th anniversary of the start of World War II. And now the story is that the Soviet Union was as much to blame as Hitler. I mean, these are official statements from the EU. They have made these statements. So you just lie about the past. You omit, you lie, you make up, have you noticed this, the Ukraine gate? It's like they've gone down the line completely with the right-wing Ukrainian line. You don't say Kiev anymore. They're pronouncing it the way the right-wing Ukrainians tell you to say it. It's quite crazy. But you can't say that you can. That I could go around. Now suddenly they're like, it's Kiev, it's not Kiev. I was like, when did this happen? Because the Azov battalion told you to. So that's how they do it. Those are some examples of how they do it.
Go ahead. Yeah.
In the case of Ukraine, it's so crazy that you can't even bring up the fact that Obama rejected sending the weapons that Trump briefly froze. The only reason why we're even talking about these weapons is because, Obama was heavily pressured by people like Bill Taylor, who was the Democrats' first star witness, to send these weapons to Ukraine back in 2014, 2015. Bill Taylor at the time wrote a letter to the Washington Post saying that Obama's policy of not sending these weapons amounted to appeasement of Russia, sort of using a Hitler-esque reference. Now, fast forward 5 years later, and Bill Taylor is the Democrats' star witness, and we can't even talk about the fact that Obama, it was the official Democratic Party policy and U.S. policy to not send the weapons. The only reason they're being sent is because Trump gets into office. He's now facing this heavy pressure from the bipartisan foreign policy establishment to do what Obama wouldn't do. But this time, he's also being accused of being a Russian puppet and conspirator. So I think that heavily weighed in his consideration to do it. One other thing I want to say on the issue of historic amnesia, and it's relevant because we're a progressive gathering, and I want to read you something. This is something said this week by a prominent journalist talking about the Iraq War and Iran. He says, the U.S. invasion of Iraq was an historic mistake, a strategic blunder of massive proportions. We invaded and Iran won the war. That is a lesson to be learned today in how we operate in the Middle East and what we do in the Middle East. It is such a huge thing to admit to yourself as a country that everything we've done in Iraq for the last 15 years was a mistake. All these lives were lost in vain. All the money poured into there has gone for a misbegotten, tragic mistake that we have benefited what we now consider one of our biggest enemies, Iran. So who am I quoting there? I'm not quoting Thomas Friedman. I'm not quoting Thomas Friedman in the pages of the New York Times. I'm not quoting somebody from the Brookings Institution or the Atlantic Council. I'm quoting James Risen of The Intercept speaking on Democracy Now. And the context he's speaking in, he's talking about these some leaked cables that The Intercept is being reporting on, talking about Iran and its role in Iraq. But this to me just captures the drift to the right that we're talking about, and the veneration that's developed for the national security state and its imperatives, and how it's warped thinking on the left. And I think when we talk about historical amnesia, it's really important to be concerned about where it's happening close to home.
Anyone seen the Snowden files around? It's like looking for the Afikoman on Passover. Like, what happened to the Snowden files?
Yeah, that is a definite question. 90% have never been released of the Snowden files?
The Snowden files disappear, and then the Iran leaks materialize just as the U.S., Saudi Arabia, and Israel are seeking to spin protests in Iraq that started as anti-corruption protests into anti-Iran protests. And the Iran leaks supposedly detail the Iranian takeover of Iraq. Convenient timing. The Intercept doesn't know the source of these leaks. Neither do we. But we do know a veteran Israeli reporter is a co-author of this report, Ronan Bergman, whose last book was blurbed by Ehud Barak and the former director of the Shin Bet, Tamir Pardo. Just suspicious.
By the way, and I didn't. And he also authored a book subtitled something about Iran being the world's biggest terrorist power. But anyway, I didn't spell out why that comment from Ryzen on democracy now was so objectionable, and it's obvious. But I just want to spell it out that the reason the Iraq War was horrible is because it destroyed countless lives and destroyed a country, and we had no right to do it. And now we have adversarial progressives talking about it in the same way that you would find in the New York Times, that in the same way they talked about the Vietnam War. The outer limit of permissible dissent on the Vietnam War in the mainstream was, oh, it was a mistake, it was an error. No, it was a crime against humanity, and we shouldn't lose sight of that.
And by the way, Max mentioned the effort to switch the Iraq protests into anti-Iran protests. 2 weeks ago, I think it was, New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, which is owned by News Corp, did identical cover, above the fold stories, not identical stories, but identical photo, nearly identical headline, saying that Iraqi protesters are saying Iran, get out. It's all Iran's fault. And I was like, that's interesting to see the cover of the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times be almost identical at the same time. But let's see. I wanted to ask, and actually that is a perfect segue. Max, I wanted to ask, how does, in the large scale propaganda, how do you feel it ends up happening? Like, I think a lot of people don't believe that an outlet like NPR is told to do negative stories about Venezuela and support a coup there that kills, our economic sanctions that kill thousands. So I think people want to know, how is it that the large-scale propaganda ends up happening in such like lockstep on something like that, something like the chemical weapons, something like Russiagate?
That only happens at RT, Lee. Putin hacks your brain, and then you start telling you start echoing Kremlin propaganda. That's what, if you're anti-war now, you're echoing Kremlin propaganda. Basically, if you're speaking unforbidden truths, you can be accused of that. What happens at NPR? I never worked at NPR. I've noticed that NPR has changed dramatically since I used to listen to it when I was a kid. Going on vacations with my family. What was it? You had all these kind of like drab personalities, and it didn't seem that it wasn't that overt. It was liberal, but it wasn't that overt. And now it's like the kind of NPR voice stays the same. This is Ari Shapiro, and we're going to do a special on Russiagate, and then we're going to an eclectic saltwater taffy factory in New England. But the propaganda is just balls to the wall. NATO propaganda, and I call it national propaganda radio. And this is the most insidious aspect of the information war, is that the trusted outlets that people know and respect, who are a part of the kind of educated, liberal, middle, and upper middle class on the coasts, people who are very influential in their communities, who come out and vote, they're the most impacted by this propaganda. So they listen to NPR, and they trust what they're hearing about Venezuela being ruled by a dictator who enjoys starving his own people. I mean, when Trump turned on the regime change operation in Venezuela by recognizing Juan Guaido, every time I turned on NPR, it seemed like there was a segment about suffering Venezuelans on the Colombian side of the border, and they send down these correspondents, and whether they're a bunch of spooks or not, even though they're working for a U.S. public broadcaster, they believe they're American exceptionalists. They believe in the mission of the U.S. exporting democracy abroad. That's just who they are. That's who NPR chooses for the job, and they're also opportunistic, and they know that they'll be rewarded for reporting that side of the story and that angle, that narrative. And they don't understand that the rewards come, and the rewards are generated through an apparatus of, for example, award ceremonies like the Pulitzer Organization and the Knight Center and all these journalist foundations that are funded by billionaires who substantially act as national security state cutouts, who include people like Pierre Omidyar, who is the owner of The Intercept, but who owns a vast media network and owns, he funds the Committee to Protect Journalists, which I think has said nothing about the shuttering of Bolivia TV and all of the pro-Evo outlets in Bolivia. These are just corporate funded, and you look at who they honor year after year at their ceremonies, and they're honoring journalists who advance the regime change line. So there's an incentive to amplify the narrative and participate in the information war, and there's a disincentive to being us. I'm under constant attack in so many ways. It's very unpleasant. It's great to see all this support, but it's very unpleasant. And I know everyone on this panel has experienced that. And Lee's employer was essentially subjected to a FBI CIA investigation. And they were labeled foreign agents. There aren't that many opportunities for young journalists who are of an anti-imperialist mindset or critical of U.S. foreign policy. Where can they work? Where can they go? I tried to create the Gray Zone to get a few of my, help a few of my friends find a platform, but thank you. But we can only do so much. We can only do so much. We don't have Omidyars to, back us up.
Well, people know what their bosses want. It's pretty clear that you have to have, first of all, there are fewer in journalism. There are fewer and fewer places to work, fewer and fewer jobs. And now if you don't toe the line, you don't work. And people know, and they don't have to say it. It's just clear. If you say these things, you can work. If you say something else, you can't work. The people who offer the counter narrative are disappeared. They're unseen. There were people who used to be, I'm thinking of Professor Stephen Cohen. He was always, my whole life, he was like one of the go-to Russia experts on the Sunday morning talk shows. He had op-eds in the New York Times and the Washington Post. Now forget it. You don't hear anything. You have to go looking for him to find out what somebody who's knowledgeable about Russia says, but he doesn't say the right thing.
Can I just add one thing before you finish? The Daily Beast did an article that got national coverage about how Tulsi Gabbard was being supported by Putin apologists.
Like Stephen Cohen.
Like donations. And they found 3 people. One was Stephen Cohen. Number 2 was a correspondent from Redacted Tonight. So a comedian who's on my show donated to Tulsi Gabbard. And this was their proof that all Putin apologists are donating to Tulsi Gabbard.
And as this goes on, it gets worse, obviously, because there is a kind of a dictatorship. We don't have a free press. We don't have a free press. If telling the truth gets you disappeared, then we don't really have a democracy. We don't really have a free press. And we need to just say that. But people know. They won't say it, but they just do it. So this crackpot who's always on Joy Reid show, what is it, that horrible man? Malcolm Nance is on NPR, and apparently they let him talk for 15 minutes straight, never even asked him a question. He just went on and on about Trump is a Russian asset, and and so some guy, and that what does that tell you? Some crackpot from nowhere gets elevated. Now he's making a small fortune. He gets to be considered a credible source. So people know the deal, and they know what to say and what not to say.
Yeah, compare Nance to Stephen Cohen. Stephen Cohen is the premier Russia scholar of our time, who lived in Moscow and produced just path-breaking work about, for example, survivors of the gulags. He was kind of a liberal about the possibilities of reforming the Soviet Union, of the Soviet Union surviving, alternative scenarios. He really challenged people to think differently about U.S.-Russia relations. He speaks Russian. He knows the Russian leadership. He knows the people of Russia. Malcolm Nance. Who the hell is this guy? He doesn't speak Russian. I don't know if he's ever been to Russia. He has no expertise on Russia. He was a contractor in the UAE for some time and was a Navy petty officer. and that's who we hear about Russia. That's who, no offense, but, older liberals who are like, just hanging out at home, semi-retired, and you just, you're cooking in the kitchen, and you turn on MSNBC, and it just starts to slowly seep into your brain, whatever Malcolm Nance is saying.
Yeah.
And you turn just crazy. I mean, and these people who I know, and we all know, become impossible to be around.
I can tell you with Cohen, with Stephen Cohen, he's also faced a lot of marginalization in the left at his own publication, The Nation magazine, where I also write. It's a struggle there, and I've benefited from the fact that he's not interviewed a lot of places, because I now have him on as much as I can on my show Pushback on the Gray Zone. I also have on someone like Ted Postal, an eminent professor emeritus at MIT, who's been done a lot of work on the alleged chemical weapons attack in Duma that we've talked about before that was blamed on the Syrian government, and that allegation led to U.S. airstrikes. Well, Postal's been doing work to show, in his view, that there was not a chemical weapons attack. And now even with two whistleblowers, still only the U.S. media outlets to mention it are very few. There's us at the Gray Zone, there's Mint Press News, Sputnik, I'm sure, and RT have done it, but pretty much otherwise it's censored, and it's extraordinary that even people with credentials, official credentials, Ted Postal, Stephen Cohen, from these top universities, can't even get interviewed anymore. It's strange.
Well, at least CNN has Noam Chomsky on a lot, so there's that. All right, so we're going to do questions from you all. How does this work? Is there a mic or?
Yeah, we're going to have the mic and have the people go around to them, or
So he's coming around with the mic, I guess, and so whoever you give the mic to will be the one asking the question. So it's up to you. Rather than me running you around the room.
You're going to set me up for this, aren't you?
Yeah. Oh, you want him to line up? All right, so he's asking that you line up in the center, and then your question will be addressed. And please try your best to not give a treatise that goes on for 25 minutes. Yeah, he's telling me it's a 1 minute limit, so. Do we have the first one?
I believe so.
All right.
Hey, Lee.
Hello.
One of the greatest hoaxes, propaganda perpetrated on the American people in 2001, which Congress renewed today, the Patriot Act. And there's absolutely nothing patriotic about the Patriot Act.
I don't know if that's a question, but Margaret Kimberley, would you like to talk about the Patriot Act?
Thank you very much.
No, okay, never mind.
Thank you, guys. So I had several thoughts that came to my mind while you were all speaking. I wrote some of them down. I'd love to hear what your thoughts are on. Okay, I will make it very quick.
Well, one or two questions, but you have to put them together. You have to put them together when you ask them.
All right, I will make it very quick. So when you talk about the intelligence community being behind Russiagate, the intelligence community infiltrating the mainstream news, James Clapper, Brennan, all their intent is to remove Donald Trump from office. I think that that's an important connection that may not be being made here. In my opinion, it's not necessarily just to do with the fact that he beat her, but it has to do with their lack of control. And just that in terms of voices being censored, I believe that voices are being censored across the political spectrum. On the quote left and on the quote conservative side, basically the intent is to force everybody into a center narrative, an approved center narrative. And then lastly, regarding Latin America, the CIA, speaking of intelligence communities, has infiltrated Latin America and been there for decades. And we all know what happened in 1963. And I just wonder whether you think that our president has control over what happens in Latin America. Thank you very much.
That's a great question.
I wanted to, first of all, this phrase intelligence community. It's so weird to me. It's the surveillance state. I mean, what is this word community? It's just, they were called the surveillance agencies or the surveillance state, and suddenly this word community gets, the CIA and FBI get to be described that way. That's propaganda, the fact that it exists at all. But I think going to come out, and that's part of their zeal for Ukraine Gate, is the role that Clapper and Brennan played in spying on Trump. They did spy on Trump. Being Trump, he gets it wrong. He says, Obama tapped my phone or something stupid. It's like, no, dude, that's not how it works. But they were spying on him because they did not trust him to stick with the imperialist consensus. No, I'm not saying Donald Trump is a peacemaker or a leftist, but they did not want him. And now they have to cover their tracks for what they did. And I'm hoping, though, that it all comes out. It has to come out. And if it remains a secret, that is not good for the country as a whole. It's not good for the left. It's not good for the anti-war movement.
And I wanted to add that I think, in terms of whether Trump has control of our military-industrial complex, I think that it's largely been like a soft coup in terms of foreign policy. Like when he says we're withdrawing troops from Syria, we don't withdraw troops from Syria. When he says there's going to be peace with North Korea, there's not going to be peace with North Korea. And there's $21 trillion of unaccounted for adjustments at the Pentagon. It's completely running unfettered, and Congress has just let go of any responsibility for those decisions.
Just quickly on the CIA in Latin America, I think we're also forgetting one of the key instruments for U.S. influence in Latin America and coup making, which is the School of the Americas, now renamed WINSEC. And we have published, and I'm sure some of you have participated with, Father Roy in the protests at Fort Benning in Georgia that take place regularly outside this terror academy, where Latin American military personnel, officer level personnel, are educated for insurrection and repression. So we published an article by Jeb Sprague, who is an academic now in California, analyzing the connections between the Bolivian coup and the key military officials, and the School of the Americas found that 6 of the key coup leaders in the military were trained at Fort Benning, and that the police officials who helped spur this coup and really turn the screw on November 9th, the day before Eva was forced out, were brought to Washington through a program called APALA. It's spelled A-P-A-L-A, and it's overseen by the FBI, and they are essentially trained and indoctrinated by the FBI in Washington and sent back. This really can illustrate why these figures who Evo has said he never thought would behave disloyally to him had been placed there all along, and now there are allegations that Williams Kaliman, the former Minister of Defense, has accepted a $1 million payoff and been relocated to Miami. This is going around on Bolivian Twitter.
Next question.
Hi, first of all, I'm nervous. You guys are my news. I don't.
Thank you.
Thank you. You and a couple of others, Jimmy Dore, a couple of others. And my question is a little bit personal. As you know, maybe other people here identify, about 95% of people I know are listening to propaganda. And so I really don't have anybody to talk to, very few people to talk to. This is kind of my coming out.
We'll hang out.
It's a little bit of my coming out here.
This is a safe space.
I have been to Jimmy Dore's show. I have been to your show. I have met Aaron. Anyway, and also having come from the Soviet Union, if I say something anti-Russiagate, God forbid, you know what will happen, right? Because I speak Russian, and that means, even though I come from Ukraine, that means that I am somehow, Soviet or something, or, pro Putin or whatever, pro something. And so that's kind of, my question is really like, do I need to find all new friends? Well, I don't know how to be out there with you know, not being one of those propagandized too. How to be out in that world. That's my question.
You need to add to your friends list. It's very difficult when the people you're close to. I first went through this when Obama was elected, and being a black person who spoke against Obama was one of the loneliest things and I thought it would be over. Now it's been replaced by, you know, anti-Russia mania. We're in a church, you know, pass the peace, shake hands with each other, make friends. So yes, keep listening to us and keep doing things like this. And they love to make you think you're alone, and nobody believes what you believe, nobody thinks what you think. And I think it's very important that we do whatever we can to maintain these connections so that we know that we're not alone.
The one thing I can add, I don't know if it's helpful or not. First of all, I can just say that I really empathize. I've had the same experience. It's been a lonely time, and I'm grateful to work with Max and others who keep me sane. It's a privileged position, but I don't know, the one thing that comes to mind is there's like that book, The 4 Agreements by Don Miguel Ruiz. Well, he has these 4 agreements to make with yourself, and one of them is don't take anything personally. And I think with politics, it's really easy to identify with your politics, and if you identify with your politics and you're on the left, especially the faction of left that we're on, you're going to suffer a lot because there's a lot of horror in the world, and you're seeing a lot of people who are blind. And I try to think about, well, just, you know, keep that commitment, but don't take anything personally. So don't take the disappointment of nothing changing and of people getting crazier and crazier. Don't take that personally. That's what comes to mind for me. Okay.
Hi, I have 2 basic points that I'd like to see get your reaction to. One is how propaganda manufactures consent. To me, Russiagate has 3 purposes. One was as a scapegoat for the Democratic Party loss. The second was to create a blanket of what's permissible and not permissible dissent. And probably more important than anything, I think, is to get Russia. And that Russiagate is really more about Russia than it is about Trump. And I think it'll be proven out if the Democrats win, because they're still going to go after balkanizing and dismembering Russia. That's been a long-term strategy. So that's my point number 1. The second is, I think it should be noted that George Kennan, who is one of the architects of the Cold War, he basically said that at some point we're going to have to shed the rhetoric of human rights in our competition with the Soviet Union. In the last few months, Trump has said, why aren't we at war with Venezuela? They have all that oil. And just last week, he said, we're going to keep the oil. Now, this is quite a departure from the usual bullshit that we're fed about U.S. policy abroad. So I'd like to get your reaction to those 2 points.
I'm glad you said that. I agree completely. And you know, part of the reason there's so much discomfort and hatred of Trump among the national security elite is because he expresses their agenda without the mask of human rights. He's just lifting the mask, which I deeply appreciate. I thank Donald Trump for that. We all owe him a debt of gratitude for exploding the contradictions of empire before our eyes, day after day after day. Russiagate did not begin with Donald Trump's election or campaign, and it will not end with it, as we see with the demonization of figures like us or Tulsi Gabbard by Hillary Clinton. It will ultimately be used to target and destroy the left, as McCarthyism was. It is McCarthyite in the way it's expressed domestically, and it relates to deep fear of the looming multipolar world that Russia and China are helping to bring into existence. I watched in Managua's Plaza de Fe at the 40th anniversary of the Sandinista Revolution as which is demonized now by this government is demonized by many people in the left, even as they make advancements in infrastructure and education and healthcare, and do much of what Evo Morales has done in Bolivia and actually defeat a U.S.-backed coup. But Delcy Rodriguez, the vice president of Venezuela, spoke before this crowd of 500,000 people, a substantial portion of the Nicaraguan population, and she stood up and she said that as Donald Trump and John Bolton seek to put their dirty hands on Venezuela, Russia has stood as our heroic protector, and that crowd of 500,000 people, average working Nicaraguans, just stood up and cheered, and that terrifies the U.S. national security state, because it means that independent states and socialist states will find more powerful states to help offset the impact of unilateral economic coercive measures, non-conventional warfare, and just straight up coups and regime changes. However, the rhetoric of human rights remains central to the fragmentation of Russia and China in the great power competition, and we see that, for example, in Xinjiang, with the constant stories about China's not just discrimination against the Uyghurs, who are Uyghur Muslims, which I believe must be real. I haven't been there, but we constantly hear about 1.5 million Uyghurs, which is over 1 out of 13 Uyghurs in Xinjiang being in concentration camps. The evidence that I've seen comes from Radio Free Asia, which is a wing of Voice of America. It comes from human rights groups, the National Endowment for Democracy, which funds the Uyghur World Congress. I haven't seen enough to tell me that 1.5 million people are in these camps, but China has been sanctioned by Mike Pompeo over this, and this human rights rhetoric has fallen on very fertile soil in the U.S. progressive community. So I think, after Trump, they're going to go back to the human rights, humanitarian interventionist rhetoric, if there is an after Trump. Trump has predicted that he'll be in power till 2080, so we don't know.
Well, and speaking of those in prison, let's not forget that America has the most people in prison per capita in the world. We are the largest prison state, so, I think it's time we be sanctioned.
Yes.
Or just bombed. I mean, R2P, responsibility to protect. That's about bombing. Why not bomb Rikers Island? Bomb the highways to Rikers.
Samantha
I don't want it to happen. I'm against bombing anything, but I'm just playing with flipping the rhetoric on its head.
All right, love you guys. By the way, thanks for all you're doing. I see a lot of Occupy friends here tonight, and when people push back against injustice by occupying public spaces or taking to the streets, we see what's happening because we're there in real time, and then we look at mainstream media and we see it either completely erased and ignored or framed in a completely different way. And I've seen that with Black Lives Matter. I've seen it with the climate justice movement. I saw it May Day of 2012, 50,000 people in the streets, not even covered. And of course, Lee, you were there with us the night that they tore down Occupy. And the coverage was almost non-existent. My question is, what do we do, or what's your take on how the media erases or reframes protest, and what can we do about it?
Have more protests, and big ones, A few weeks ago in Brooklyn, there was video of 2 incidents of police brutality, and a group I was not that familiar with decolonized this place. Scott, that's you? What's happening Friday? 122nd. At the Harriet Tubman, Friday at what time? 5:15. Okay. So these mostly young people, they got 1,000 people. That's what it looked like to me, at least 1,000 people in downtown Brooklyn, who took over the subway stations, who took over the streets. Now, it did not get a lot of press. So yes, we have a big problem with censorship, but I just make it bigger. I think that's all. It has to be something that is difficult to ignore. It has to be something that has to be seen, and we have to learn from our friends and allies in other countries. There are people in Bolivia, they're running to La Paz. I saw this video, looked like somebody's cell phone. People, thousands of people heading to La Paz to try to break this coup. And unfortunately, we're told to hit the streets to stop Trump. Well, you know, okay, but I tell everybody the way to fight Trump, first you have to fight the Democratic Party, so we need to hit the streets about other things. So just keep doing it. That's my advice.
And I think we need to keep building up independent media outlets, other ways of getting the word out. Make sure your protests have an impact, are intended to have an impact. Don't just get a permit for 2 hours. That's called a parade, all right? That's a parade. Don't call it a protest. A protest is not expected. It gets in the way of business as usual, and he mentioned Occupy, where we were on, down at Zuccotti Park, and actually that was, maybe I was late to the game, but I wasn't that old, but when Occupy started, that was when I woke up to what NPR was, because they basically were not talking about Occupy in the first couple of weeks. Then when they were forced to talk about it, they had these little flaccid limp dick debates that said nothing. And I realized, they're not actually talking about how important this is, how many people this is, how it's a global protest movement. And you just got to get to the point that the mainstream media kind of can't ignore it. They look like idiots because it's gotten too large. That's what happened at Standing Rock. It just got too large for them to keep denying it. All right, next question.
Hi, everybody. My name's Amir. I'm a journalist. I want to say, first off, the Gray Zone and Black Agenda is really, it's an oasis in this media desert. We're here talking about propaganda, and you always feel crazy when you talk to your friends or family. I used to work at Chuck E. Cheese. I worked there for 5.5 years, and they used to call us castmates, not employees, right? And they used to play music all over the place, and they would tell you how great this is and how you can rise up in the company. And I would think this is all bullshit, right? And I would tell my castmates, well, you see I'm using that language. I'll tell my coworkers this is all bullshit, but they would believe that maybe they can rise up and stuff. And I feel like right now with the media, this is what's going on, right? I wanted to ask, my question is about Hong Kong. If protesters in Ferguson, in Occupy Wall Street, in Zuccotti Park, would go out to the streets and protest, they would crush them, right? They had crushed them.
How about throw Molotov cocktails?
Oh my God, but forget about it. But in Hong Kong, they crushed them. So what's they let them, they're out there. So I wanted to know your opinion on Hong Kong.
Aaron? Well, first I recommend Dan Cohen's piece on Hong Kong that was published at the Gray Zone. It's one of our most popular pieces because so many people know something is wrong with this. They know that the U.S. is heavily involved through groups like the NED and USAID that I talked about, and pro-U.S. billionaires like Jimmy Lai is involved in funding and supporting the apparatus of these protests. And as we've watched over the weeks, mainland Chinese people being attacked in the streets, a person being just punched in the face for saying we are all Chinese, a man arguing with the protesters is lit on fire, as Chavistas were in Venezuela in 2017 during the Guarimbas. We're seeing just a really sadistic campaign with one agenda. The only agenda that I can identify, and we're going to publish a piece on this at the Gray Zone, is to get this sanctions bill passed, the Hong Kong Freedom and Human Rights Act, which was introduced by Marco Rubio and I think Bob Menendez, APAC, the Cuban-American senator who is basically has his name on every sanctions bill. And the Hong Kong protesters came out for that bill. They had a protest for a U.S. sanctions bill. So that tells you everything about why they're referred to as pro-democracy protesters in mainstream media. It tells you everything about it, and why we are, compelled to celebrate them, and why, if we raise any criticisms about them, we are described as sort of echoing Chinese and pro-Beijing propaganda. But this is, it's a separatist movement, and it relates to the U.S. agenda of fragmenting China from the East and the West and surrounding it with a perfect noose in the form of countless U.S. military bases and, naval way stations. Good.
And before
Also, I loved Chuck E. Cheese as a kid. Pizza's really bad for you, but I would love to go back and experience that. You brought some joy back to me. Although Chuck, is it Chuck? Do they call the mascot Chuck?
Chuck E, yeah.
Chuck E. He's
Chuck
kind
E.
of creepy.
Middle name E.
He's kind of like a creepy rat. It's just a little weird. Anyway.
I just want to say that before I even read anything about Hong Kong and read Dan Cohen's piece on the gray zone, just contrasting the way the protest in Hong Kong was portrayed and how the protests in Gaza are portrayed here. And that to me said enough about whether there was an agenda afoot. And I want to actually recommend, if you haven't seen these films, Max Blumenthal and Dan Cohen made a film called Killing Gaza, and Abby Martin and Mike Preisner just made a film called Gaza Fights for Freedom. And what's the amazing part of both these films is showing how these brave protesters, in the face of one of the world's most lethal armies and brutal armies, how brave they were every week. And you just compare how they're discussed with how the Hong Kong protesters are valorized here, and I think that says a lot right there.
Yeah, who's acknowledged and who isn't? You can always tell. It's, that may seem simplistic, but 99% of the times you'll be right if you see who's telling you who's good and who's bad. That tells the story.
Look at contrast them with how they're portrayed in Baltimore or in Ferguson. Ted Cruz and Marco Rubio, they love Black Bloc when it's abroad. They love Antifa when it's over there. It's something we should really consider.
And anytime a protest is covered on all your mainstream outlets, there's generally a reason for that. Because there are protests going on around the world almost all the time, especially recently, and 90% of them are completely ignored. However, they find one or two that we need to talk about all the time. And you ask yourself, why is that? Why is that protest so important to them? Because there's almost always a reason.
They're telling us 1 minute that we should take 3 at the same time or something.
Oh, okay, so they're telling us 1 minute, so maybe if we do the last 3 questions at once, and we'll try to get to those last 3, I guess.
Thank you to all the panel for the great and beautiful work that you're doing. It's when somebody's a real journalist because they usually get arrested. My question is this. Since we're talking about propaganda, there seems to be one act that transitioned us from Chomsky's manufacturing consent in 1988 to this Orwellian Ministry of Truth, rewrite reality. And even the most progressive platforms, I noticed, don't broach this subject, and even people like Chomsky don't broach this subject. And that is the 9/11 attacks, which to me appear in the same genre as the Epstein suicide. I'm curious as to where the panelists stand on this issue. Thank you.
Okay, so let's grab 2 more and we'll answer all 3 at once as our conclusion.
Forgive me, I'm a terrible public speaker. Lee, I have a question. What was that Bernie staffer's name that was on your show?
The what?
The Bernie staffer who said that Bernie never had a shot in hell of getting past the...
Nick Brana?
Yeah.
Nick Brana, he also started Movement for a People's Party.
Yeah, okay. So before everybody cheers, I have a couple part question. So if you, obviously you know that he never had a shot in hell. He was on your show and he said it. It was plain as day. So seeing as how absolutely nothing has changed, why do you guys stand Bernie so much? And how possible is it that he's just a sheepdog? The whole thing is propaganda, a whole psyop to get people to the polls. Because before he started running, suddenly everybody started dropping off and nobody was really voting. And then all of a sudden people were starting to go to the polls and then, oh, he lost and now we all have to vote for Hillary. It's going to be the same thing this time, I promise you.
All right.
Okay? So knowing this, and you are in a unique position to know this, why do you gotta stand him?
I have a lot to say about that. Let's grab 1 more and then we'll answer all of them.
You did well.
Thank you.
Margaret Kimberley talked about how the actual difference between the two parties is getting very slim. At the same time, we have others, Matt Taibbi among them, talking about how the theatrical red team, blue team game is being stoked like it's a sports thing. I invite you to talk about the way that's used as a distraction. At the same time, I also invite you to say whether you may have noticed what I think I've noticed, which is these investigations like Russiagate are also calibrated to stoke that sort of red team, blue team division. And listening to Whitney Webb's reports, I realized that it's a lot like the Clinton investigation when he was under impeachment.
So time is tight, so should we just answer this and then call it, or?
We can try and get a few more in.
All right, so we'll answer these and we might have one more. I'll go off what Chuck says. So I'll address the question that was directed at me. So Nick Brana was director of national outreach under Bernie Sanders, and he said Bernie never really had a shot because, and now we know, and actually Donna Brazile, former head of the DNC, said it. It was, not only was it rigged in multiple ways, but it was financially rigged. Money was laundered back to the Hillary campaign, and in a court case in Florida, the DNC said they have no obligation to have a legitimate primary. Their lawyers, DNC lawyers, said it is our right to pick the candidate in a smoke-filled room if we want to. And I absolutely agree with all that. I don't think Bernie Sanders is a psyop. I mean, that would be a long con because he's been at it for 40 years or whatever. But it is, I think the only way for someone who is outside of the mainstream, and Bernie definitely is outside the mainstream Democrats, I think the only way any of them have a chance that are outside the mainstream is to swamp what's stolen, which he very nearly did at the last primary. He swamped what was stolen in a variety of ways. Voter suppression, interstate cross-check, the fucking machines that you have no accountability, their proprietary code to corporations, they're closing polling places, the super delegates. The list is immense as to how this thing is rigged, and I didn't even get into the money. And so for someone to get past all of that, it's incredibly difficult. So I don't know that I'm disagreeing with you. I think I'm agreeing with a lot of what you said. I think that last thing on to voting as a whole, I think you should view it, and the co-host of my podcast, Eleanor Goldfield, said this, I think you should view it like picking up litter. It is something you should do to be a good citizen. It has a little bit of impact, but it is not going to change the world, all right? We should not act like all of our energy and all of our activism should be put into voting. It should not dictate all of your conversations, because if it does, you've already lost. You're already putting your entire life into this political charade. So it should be a very tiny thing you do. So yes, go vote, and then go get active.
I would say about Bernie Sanders, and I think they will steal it from him. The question's not what Bernie's going to do, it's what are those of you who are his supporters, what are you going to do? And you can't stay in the Democratic Party, which I already left, so that's not an issue. But that's the question for me, what are you going to do? And there were a couple other questions, I can't remember what they were now.
One was about the red-blue dynamic, and one was about 9/11. Any takers?
I would just refer to my book and what I think about 9/11 truth, and also about 9/11 and what's been left out, including what's in the 28 pages. And I think it's really important to know more about the Saudi connection. I'll leave it at that.
The Saudi connection is incredibly important.
I can talk about it all night, but I feel like there's more questions.
Yeah, and I think that if they wanted us to have legitimate answers about it, then they would do a legitimate investigation, but they don't. They don't want,
No, but you know what, listen, I don't want to get into a 9/11 debate, but I just want to say that in the same way that I reject pseudo-experts like Bellingcat weighing in on Syria gas attacks and claiming that their open source satellite research proves that the Assad government carried out all these attacks that then justified U.S. military strikes. I don't recognize who I see as pseudo-experts weighing in on jet fuel and proving that the explosions were staged. I just don't. I actually believe the official story there, and I concur that the Saudi thing is interesting, worth investigating, but I think focusing on these things is leads to dangers, and it distracts us from taking on more important issues.
I had a question for everybody, more or less, not just a question, but sort of a wake-up call. I belong to NYC 5G wake-up call, and I'm very, very concerned about the technology and technocratic overlay of everything right now. You cannot be in a subway train without seeing people totally engrossed in their phone. Young people have grown up in this age and they are addicted to their phones, and now with the 5G roll-up, there's a really great chance that the government has its way to beam its way straight into our brain. And a lot of I think it's a $30 million, 15-year-long study shows that even 4G is harmful to us, and it is an extinction problem. Now, the New York Times is partnering up with Verizon and other agencies of the telcos, and they are promoting this. And how do we break through the propaganda on this? People do not even want to be bothered. They think quicker downloads, whoopee, you know. Meanwhile, they're roasting their testicles through their pockets. And
do not roast your testicles, folks. Please.
They call that Rocky Mountain oysters in Colorado. Let's take another question before we go in.
Well, I will say just one thing, is that I don't think it's crazy to ask that anything in our society be actually tested well before it's unveiled across the population. Scientific American just did a large article about not saying 5G is going to kill you, just saying there haven't been legitimate studies showing it to be safe. So demanding studies is not crazy.
Well, since you're already answering it, our friend who's sometimes Gray Zone contributor was a correspondent at RT America. Dan Cohen did a multi-part series on the science on the dangers of 5G, and then the New York Times proceeded to do an article without disclosing its partnership with Verizon on how Russia is trying to stop 5G through Russian propaganda, just because Dan did those reports. Because Putin was like beaming, through gamma rays into his brain, commands to do those reports. But you go over to Dan's house, he doesn't even have Wi-Fi there. Like everything's Ethernet, because he's freaked out about not just 5G but 4G, 6G. Putin made him do it.
And if you open a New York Times, this past week I held it up on Redacted Tonight, the New York Times had 4 pages in a row, 1/4 page ads that just say 5G Verizon. Like literally page after page after page. I can't imagine, the $1 million ad campaign is crazy. But meanwhile they're like, but 5G's fine, by the way, we're taking millions of dollars from Verizon.
Okay, so my question was, after these U.S.-backed color revolutions, like in Bolivia, we're seeing the coup government announce that they're going to start arresting dissident journalists, and they say they already have a list of names, possibly supplied to them by the U.S., but possibly they've just been collecting it in their spare time. We also saw this in Ukraine after the 2014 Euromaidan U.S.-backed revolution with Victoria Nuland handing out cookies in Maidan Square. There was this website that went up called Mirotvorets, which was a list of dissident journalists, basically doxing them and sticking the patriotic, quote-unquote, citizens on them. So, one, why don't we see something like this in the U.S.? We saw PropperNot, yes, but it wasn't the same sort of thing. Are we so neutered as people that we can be counted on to neutralize ourselves by people asking us not to research certain things? Sorry, Aaron, you totally just did that. And is there a way that we can make ourselves more of a threat? So that, not that we want people doxing us and stalking us, but the fact that we can neutralize ourselves is pretty scary.
All right, so he just told me it's going to be that question plus your question. I'm sorry, everybody else, but we're going to take these 2, and then that is it. But we'll be standing up here after. So.
Just 5 seconds.
Yeah.
What is the solution? I guess you see the propaganda, you all agree that it's a problem. So what is the solution from each of you? Just can you?
Good question. Let's go down the line, and that will be our conclusion.
I don't have a solution. I'm just going to keep doing more journalism. I'm just going to keep growing the gray zone. And that's the best I can do. I'll try to keep it going. On the previous question, and I think that just goes for everyone. You just have to do more of what you're currently doing. And I really do feel like we're having an effect, and there is an opening in the narrative because the corporate media and the established political apparatus is so discredited. It's just discrediting itself before anyone's eyes who's able to see. On the last question, it's interesting, you mentioned this blacklist that was established in Ukraine after the Maidan of journalists, including Western journalists who had just gone into the Donbass to report on the wrong side. And some of them a few of them have been killed. The person who conceived that blacklist, I believe, entered the Ukrainian government recently in a high-level position, if I'm not mistaken. Ministry of Truth, yes, it's not even a joke. It's not even a joke. And so we're always told, oh, Zelensky's president, he's Jewish and he's liberal, and so this whole fantasy about right-wingers is they're just a small, marginal little aspect. They're just a few Nazis in a basement. No, they really do. They control the Interior Ministry, and the Interior Ministry gives, supplies to the National Corps, who are the Azov battalion that's moved into Kiev to actually intimidate the masses. They have prevented Zelensky from disarming some of their militias in the east, and just simply said, "I don't care if you're the president. We're the men with the guns here. We're in charge." And Zelensky was like, "All right, I guess I'm just a reality show host. I got to go home." So it's a very scary situation, and what we see here is much more sophisticated and subtle. One, mechanism of generating consent that we haven't talked about. Chris Hedges actually did a series of interviews that I thought were really illuminating on Wikipedia. My Wikipedia page is basically a bulletin board for everybody who hates me. And then, you have. And one of the most prolific editors of Wikipedia is Philip Cross. We don't exactly know who he is, but it's almost like a military-style operation, doing 40 to 50 edits a day. He deprioritized my awards and accolades on my page, but anyone who's anti-imperialist or on the left who challenges the foreign policy consensus, you're going to get a visit from Philip Cross, I swear. And Jimmy Wales, who's the founder and CEO of Wikipedia, was asked about Philip Cross. What do you think about this? He said, well, I support his activities as a citizen editor. Jimmy Wales is married to Tony Blair's former communications director. He's at every kind of, Davos-style gathering. And what they've done is they created something that was supposed to be open source for the like a public encyclopedia, and gradually domesticated it along with every other social media program until it becomes kind of a information arm of the elite, where they can define you, so that the first thing that comes up on a Google search of me is every controversy or manufactured controversy that I've been involved in, and you hate me after you read it. If you read my Wikipedia page, you're probably gonna, and you're just a normie, you're probably gonna hate me.
It won me over. I hate you, Max. So,
a lot of people hate me who really know me too, but that's different.
Well, I wanted to respond to what do we do? We keep doing what we're doing. And I was thinking about with the woman who asked about people being hostile to our opinions. We have to suck it up and speak up. And because you never know when you're gonna, that right moment somebody is going to listen to you. It's important to remember nobody appreciates being insulted or being told they're stupid, but so find a way to non-judgmentally make your case at every opportunity, and it can be very awkward. And I'm not telling anybody to lose a friendship, and you shouldn't, but self-censorship is really very dangerous to us as individuals and to us as a larger group. So speak out as much as you can as an individual.
Yeah, I have nothing to add. I think Margaret and Max said it perfectly.
I'll just close by saying that I think about the amount of propaganda, of the billions of dollars that are spent, the endless airwaves, the endless airtime that is spent trying to convince all of us that war is right, that killing, that bombing innocent civilians is fine, that economic sanctions that kill people is fine, that we shouldn't care about the exploited workers across this country, the incredible poverty, the amount of effort that goes into that all of that is needed to combat the fact that all it takes is one of us to speak to someone else in a one-on-one situation and show them that we shouldn't be bombing innocent civilians, that we should care about the poverty in this country, etc., etc. Human beings naturally want to head that way, and instead it takes a massive propaganda arm and operation to get us to do the opposite. So I think the cracks are there in this system, and I think you just got to keep pushing, because sometimes when things seem most hopeless is right before everything changes. So please tell everybody where they can find you, and also I want to give a round of applause to the Big Apple Coffee Party. Please let them hear it one more time. Please say the website one more time.
Black Agenda Report, tomorrow's Wednesday. Wednesday is Black Agenda Report Day. And Twitter, I'm Freedom Ride Blog.
And I'm at thegrayzone.com. Look for the show Pushback, which I host.
I'm on JDate at, thegrayzone.com and moderaterebels.com with Ben Norton. Support us on Patreon.
And I'm at leecamp.com and Redacted Tonight, which you can grab on YouTube or anywhere. Yeah, thank you so much. Give it up for Aaron Maté, Margaret Kimberley, Max Blumenthal.
Hi, Danny. How are you? Oh, wait. Aaron, I want to introduce you to my friend, Black Agenda Report colleague, Danny Heisler.